I'm Chris. Really glad you're here. Welcome to Warrior. If you're looking for expertise in the Counter UAS series, you came to the right place today. Where do you hear our expert? We have some serious expertise. We're joined by Forecast International. They're at the forefront of cutting edge research, defense industry, technology, weapons, trends. They've been there for decades, actually. I recall talking to Forecast in 2008. Well, they're still surging, and here they are. We've got a lead analyst with counter drone technology, Mr. David Hutchins. We're going to talk about all the technology, all the challenges. We want to thank and welcome him. We've got some expertise today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Really excited to chat with you. Always love chatting about CUAS.
Absolutely about Ukraine because there are so many lessons learned. There was an
Absolutely.
Army intelligence report not long ago that said half of Russia's active duty tanks have been decimated. The T-90s have just been obliterated by switchblades and other kinds of drones. There are other instances where grenades have been mounted on drones. There's been use of drone swarms. And as you say, it's becoming increasingly multi-domain with ground and even sea or water drones. What are some of the things you're hearing about as far as how that curve is being advancing right now in Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll touch on two things. Two things come to mind immediately. One is the evolution of how drones are being used in combat. Something that has appeared a lot more in the news, and I'm sure you're aware of, is the use of, say, fiber optic cables to navigate drones in Ukraine, and that can really negate the ability to counter those systems with jamming technology. So jamming technology is meant to sever the link between the drone and its operator by overpowering it, sending a stronger signal to give that drone different instructions. Well, when there's a fiber optic cable being used, these extremely long, thin fiber optic cables, that that situation or that mitigation approach goes out the window. You have to revert back to a directed energy or a kinetic mitigation approach. So that alone is changing the game. The other thing I'm noticing is just that the drones that are being used in combat don't need to be super sophisticated systems. It can be
Right.
very simple, relatively simple and cheap systems that are modified to do the most amount of damage at the most affordable price, if you can think about it that way. So simply mounting a grenade on a drone, flying it near a vehicle, and having it take out a system much more expensive than itself.
Glad you talked about that because we were talking the other day, and I really liked your assessment and the way you were thinking about this. We were kind of trying to get down to the bottom line. How would, in the aggregate, is there, I hate the term silver bullet, it's almost too cliche, but what do you
Sure.
do against a drone swarm? Because kinetically, can you take out 100 at once unless you have something like a Sea Whiz with guided little tungsten projectiles? EW, how many can you jam at one point? And then with something like laser, that's contingent upon the environment or the operational situation. Maybe the weather is cloudy, you don't have a clear signal, or kinetic options might be limited if it's a civilian area. So there are all these different variables that go into it. You brought up that perhaps the curve might be starting to look at high powered microwave. I thought that was very intelligent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we're talking about drone swarms in particular, and that's absolutely something that we should be talking about. And folks in the military, on the industry side and the government side, are definitely looking at drone swarms as a very real threat in the immediate future. So the ability to counter that is paramount. I think the first thing that came to mind is jamming, because that can be broadcast in a much broader area, be more effective, right, than sending a bunch of missiles at incoming drones, or trying to hit drones with your traditional kinetic approaches. So as the number of drones coming at you increases, the ability to take them out one at a time via lasers or traditional munitions, it's probably a lot less effective. So you definitely want something with virtually an unlimited magazine, a jamming solution, or say a high-powered microwave that is able to continuously mitigate that threat coming in. Now, with the introduction of fiber optic cables being attached to drones, maybe not necessarily in drone swarms, but we don't necessarily know what the future will hold. If that's a capability in the near future, then jamming is going to be less effective. So that's why I have my eye on high-powered microwaves for the future, because that could definitely be an approach that's able to take out multiple drones at once that's not necessarily affected by the fiber optic cable problem.
See, that's interesting. Let's talk a little bit about that because in the RF spectrum, you think EW, there are systems now which can intercept the protocol of an RF signature and take over or essentially derail the flight path of a drone. In
That's
many
correct.
cases, using AI because it's commercially available, it's a known entity. You bounce it off the database, you're able to make the verification. But I'm really interested in your expert thoughts on this. How does microwave work? You said that that would disable the internal components of a drone. Technically speaking, how is that different than EW? A lot of people probably would be interested in hearing that.
Sure. So, and I'll preface by saying I'm not an engineer. I am an analyst. So I just pay attention to what folks in the industry tell me about what their systems are capable of doing. And my understanding is the high powered microwaves do sort of melt these internal components of a drone, knocking it out of the sky, rendering them useless. Something like a laser beam, you might understand, is also an effector that can be used for mitigation in countering drone threats. But a laser beam will also need to burn through the outer components of a drone that's coming in, which isn't an immediate effect. It would be awesome if it was just like Star Wars or sci-fi, right, where you just boom, shoot it out of the sky with one beam, but we're just not quite there yet. It really depends on how much power that laser beam can put out, how quickly it can take out a drone. But
Well,
again, if
10
we're
4,
dealing with a
I'm,
drone, type
oh,
4,
no,
yeah,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
finish your thought.
No, it's just depending on the number of threats approaching you at one time. Uh, a laser beam, a high energy laser, might be part of a layered defense approach, but you wouldn't want that to be your only mitigation solution in the event of a drone swarm.
Well, that's excellent. What you said about high powered microwaves, so it's kind of temperature driven. I mean, maybe this is just self evident, verbalizing the obvious, which, we like to do sometimes. But that's not RF, that's not electromagnetic. So it's a different transport layer. So in effect, you're affecting differently.
I view it as a directed energy approach, high energy lasers and high powered microwaves. I put that into the directed energy approach to counter UAS. It would certainly be different than maybe electronic countermeasures is a way to think about jamming and spoofing and cyber takeover and those approaches. So I kind of view them as two different buckets.
10-4. Now, we were talking the other day about lasers, and there's a lot of discussion about, and this is true with electromagnetic or EW as well, kind of creating more of a pencil beam to narrow the signature so that you're less detectable, or going quickly into passive mode so that you're not emitting, correct? But when it
Right.
comes to something like a laser, which has an optical function and ISR function as well, can you have enough mobile expeditionary power to sustain a whole ton of pencil beam lasers to take out a swarm? Is that technically becoming more and more possible? Now lasers are mounting on ISVs, infantry vehicles. They're obviously already on ships. How is the form factor and the mobile expeditionary power component evolving?
Yeah, again, I think that's a great question. I'll say that again, I'm not an engineer, but my understanding is that a key consideration here is power, and how much access to power do you have, especially if you're not in a fixed site solution, but you're in a mobile solution, something mounted on a Stryker vehicle, or a JLTV, Humvee, what have you. What access do you have to power to supply that system? That is probably going to need quite a bit of power. And I can't speak to the specifics of that, not yet. But my understanding is as a high energy laser might need to be a fixed site solution for now, or have access to power, say on a ship, like the Helios system that's being tested out on naval systems now. But that would certainly be a consideration that those warfighters want to take into account when using that system in the field is, okay, how much access to power do I have, that makes this system function? And I'll circle back to my original point that if you are facing a drone swarm, I don't think that high energy lasers is necessarily the system that you want to have by itself. You need that layered defense approach. And I can speak more to that if you want to.
Well, 10-4, I like what you said about the layered approach. It recalls to mind something I mentioned to you the other day. I had the honor of talking to the Carrier Strike Group 2 commanding officer from the Red Sea. who
Amazing.
essentially oversaw a lot of the counter drone activities with the Houthis. And there were several points that he made that I'd love to get your thoughts on. One was doctrinal. There was multi-domain kinds of connectivity that helped network target verification. He said, in one sense, it was not so much unanticipated, but there was the ability of an aircraft, like even a Growler EW aircraft, to see something in the air, use a kinetic missile, and take it out. And of course, fighter jets were also key with targeting, seeing things in the air. From what we all understand, that was a part of Israel's defense against Iran. So there was some interesting multi-domain components. And then secondly, not to jumble a bunch of questions at once, but
Oh,
he
please
also
do.
talked about magazine depth because you've got to ask him about proximity fuses and how are you from the deck of a ship taking things out. And he said you've got to have a deep magazine. You touched on this a little bit. You want to be able to sustain the fires to kind of keep the op tempo of countermeasures.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly when it comes to kinetic munition solutions, having the in-depth magazine, the depth of magazine is really important. You do not want to run out of ammunition when you're dealing with UAS approaching at high speed. So that is a very important key consideration and perhaps limitation of the mitigation approach. But you also have to consider what type of munition are you using. If you're using, let's call them traditional rounds, if you're firing a 50 cal or 240 Golf, you're using traditional ammunitions, you're going to have to put up a lot of steel in the air to take out drones before you're able to hit them. It's not going to be as precise, even with the assisted targeting systems that we have available to us today. Now, you mentioned proximity rounds. I think that's something that I'm finding really, really interesting as I dive into the research of these developments. Those proximity rounds certainly make it a lot easier, a lot more likely that you're going to hit the target. Well, let's say hit the target, right? The idea is that you don't even necessarily have to hit that fast moving, potentially small group one or group two size drone. You just have to hit near it and let that explosion take it out. And that's when, if you have multiple systems with kinetic munitions that use something like a proximity round or are laser guided, have those assisted targeting systems, you're more likely to hit multiple drones coming at one time. So it's part of that layered defense approach, having multiple mitigation systems in play at one time. But again, you have to take in consideration what your magazine capacity is. That's certainly something that you have to be focused on if you're not using something like a jamming system or a high-powered microwave or a laser, which just needs access to the right amount of power.
Wow, 10-4. Well, let's talk a little bit about there's this continuous cycle, measure, countermeasure,
Right.
countermeasure. Something like Ukraine with the cage armor on the armored vehicles or additional top-down protections because of the dismounted use of shoulder-fired anti-armor weapons, tanks are very vulnerable to attack from above, whether it's terrain or a building. What kinds of countermeasures can help ensure that things like mechanized armor can still be relevant in a drone kind of attack environment?
Yeah, I mean, we're absolutely seeing that now as this conflict continues. That kind of cat and mouse game is how I look at it. As one side advances, attack versus defense, the other side then evolves to deal with that threat. So we're seeing the application of like nets over tanks or artillery systems to help protect it against a drone that is flying in to destroy it. So I can't speak on the specifics of what's being implicated right now on the front lines because obviously I am not there, but I'm certainly keeping an eye on how things are evolving. What I'm definitely keeping an eye on is how the same type of approach will affect other areas of combat. I mentioned the application of robotics, USVs, UUVs at sea. How are we going to see naval systems evolve with a similar defense mechanism to tackle the latest developments in on this of unmanned systems, uncrewed systems at sea? How are we going to protect very expensive aircraft carriers, offshore patrol vessels, amphibious assault ships. How are we going to protect those extremely valuable assets from a very relatively inexpensive drone that can be operated under the surface? So that's something that I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for. And we can also look at current conflicts to see these evolutions take place in real time. Hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it inspired a couple of other questions. Just thinking out loud in a tactical sense, I'm interested in sort of answering this question. If you have RF and you can discern the RF protocol or the signature of an attacking drone, what if the drones are different? Can you have a signature or a signal is probably the better word that can detect and take out an entire group if the drones are all the same? Or does it have to be more narrowly configured and you would need kind of a whole bunch of them? Just thinking what you said about proximity fuses and the effectiveness of an area weapon. Can you use EW in almost an area capacity to take out or intercept a number of drones at once? But what if they're different kinds of drones?
That's a great question. I'll admit that I'm probably best not suited to get into the specifics of how those effectors work and whether or not they could affect multiple drones at the same time. But my understanding is that let's say you look at Shahed missiles, or sorry, Shahed drones being launched by Russia. If they're all operating with the same frequency, they're all the same type of drone, it's certainly possible that they could all be affected at one time. But I just don't know enough about the specifics of how those systems operate to give you a clear answer on that.
That's excellent. And then lastly, this calls to mind the question of AI, how quickly those discernments can be made, because that's increasingly, it's advancing so fast, who can keep up, right, with Chat GPT and things like this. But
Right.
even several years ago, there was looking at AI to make those discernments, sensor to shooter pairing. You have otherwise disparate pools of incoming sensor data. It gets aggregated, the analytics get performed, and then the pairing, bouncing it off a historical database as AI works. Then, of course, AI is only effective as its database. So, what happens if it comes across something that isn't previously there or isn't part of the data? So, what's your understanding of how AI is maturing and kind of being applied in an operational sense? Because this has been very much a focus for a long time.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you asked this question. And I'll circle back to a question you had asked earlier that I didn't quite answer, and that's about integrating through command and control a complete picture of the battlefield. You have so much data and information coming in as these detection, identification, and tracking systems are able to kind of paint a picture of the battlefield. And as that's coming in, it creates just a massive amount of data coming from sensors, not just on the ground, not just at a forward operating base, but potentially with the dismounted warfighter in their hands on their body-worn system. You're detecting a lot of systems, or you're collecting, excuse me, you're collecting a lot of data that's coming in at one time. And that just sheer amount of data is extremely overwhelming for any individual or even group of individuals to process. So the application of AI here is really, really key in being able to process all of that sensing information in real time to create a clear, concise picture of the battlefield and give that commanding officer, that decision maker, whoever it is, a quick rundown of here is the situation. Here are the threats you are facing. These are the mitigation options that you have. Hopefully you have a layered defense approach in place with different effectors that you can choose from. So you can then match those mitigation effectors to the threat that you're facing. And AI is absolutely going to be a key part of that moving forward in the battlefield.
Well, anyone looking for expertise is not disappointed by today's discussion. You keep saying you're not an engineer, but you sound like one or beyond. Because having guys like you and I talk to engineers all the time, and we sure try and pick up a thing or two. Thank you for your
You too,
time. Lead
Guy.
analyst, specialist in CUAS, as you obviously heard from Forecast International, David Hutchinson. I hope you'll stay with our series. We're trying to bring you the latest, most relevant, cutting edge discussions. It's with Warrior and CUAS Hub, which is part of SAE Media, a British think tank. We appreciate all your expertise and we welcome your input.